On the morning of October 14, 1887, in a mill town along the Androskagan River in western Maine, a 19-year-old weaver named Abigail Morse was pulled from the shallows just below the dam. Her hair tangled with river weed, and her left shoe was missing. Over the following 11 months, 3 different men from 3 different corners of that town would be arrested for her killing, tried in the same small courthouse, and then walk out free. Not one of them confessed. Not one of them was convicted. And by the summer of 1888, the town itself seemed to have agreed, without ever saying so aloud, that her name was never to be spoken again. What happened in those 11 months, and why every thread of the case unraveled in the hands of the men investigating it, was never written into any official history of the state of Maine. But the record survives in a handful of yellowed letters, a surveyor's private diary, the payroll ledgers of a shuttered mill, and the loose pages of a coroner who resigned 2 days before Christmas and left town on the first train that would take him. Before we continue with the story of Abigail Morse, if you are new here, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next investigation, and leave a comment below telling us which state or city you are listening from tonight. Your presence matters more than you know, because stories like this one survive only as long as someone is willing to listen, and to understand how 3 men could be accused of the same killing, and all 3 could be set free. You first have to understand the town itself, because the town is the 4th suspect in this story, and in many ways the most dangerous one. The town was called Peton Falls, and in 1887 it was not old, not by New England standards. It had been stitched together in the 1840s around a set of cotton mills, built where the Androskagan narrowed and dropped, and it had grown the way mill towns grew in that century in fast, crooked bursts, swallowing farms and pine forest and pulling in whatever cheap labor the railroads could deliver. By the time Abigail Morse was born there in 1868, Peton Falls had close to 4,000 residents, 2 large mills, a canal, a company store, 3 churches, 4 saloons, and a population split with almost no crossing between the old Yankee families who had owned the land before the mills and the 3 waves of newcomers the mills had brought in. There were the Irish, who had arrived first during the hungry years, and who now held most of the skilled positions on the looms and in the machine shops. There were the French Canadians, who had come south from Quebec in the 70s and 80s. Whole families at a time, often speaking no English, taking the lowest paid work in the weaving rooms. And there were a smaller number of Scots and Cornish, brought in as overseers and engineers, because the owners trusted them not to mix with the rank and file. The 4,000 people of Peton Falls lived in the same town, walked the same muddy streets, and drank from the same river, but they did not marry each other, did not worship in the same buildings, and did not, as a rule, tell each other's secrets. The town had a particular sound, one that anyone who lived there would carry in their body for the rest of their life. It was the sound of the falls themselves, a low, continuous roar that came up from the river day and night. Layered over that was the sound of the mills, a deeper, slower thrumming that started at 5 in the morning with the first whistle and did not stop until 9 at night. On Sundays, the mills were silent, and the falls were all you heard. The old people said you could feel the difference in your chest, the absence of a weight you had not known you were carrying. The weaving rooms themselves, when you stepped inside them, were a different climate altogether. Hot and humid in summer to keep the threads from breaking, kept damp in winter by steam pipes that hissed along the ceiling, and loud in a way that made speech almost impossible, so that the women who worked there had developed, over the decades, a whole language of gesture, lip reading, and shouted single words that conveyed the commands, warnings, and private jokes of a 12-hour shift. You could always tell a weaver on the street by the way she leaned slightly forward when spoken to, and by the way she answered you. When she answered at all, with her mouth formed more carefully than other people's mouths, as though every word had been shaped for someone who could not quite hear. The mill itself sat at the center of everything. It was owned by a man named Silas Bridgham, who had inherited it from his father, and who lived in a tall white house on a hill above the dam, where the water noise never stopped. Silas Bridgham was 61 years old in 1887, a widower, a deacon in the Congregational Church, and the single largest employer for 40 miles in any direction. He was also, as nearly every sworn statement in the later investigations would note without quite saying it, a man accustomed to being obeyed. He had large, pale hands that he kept folded when he was listening, and he listened a great deal. And when he spoke softly, so that people leaned in to hear him, which was, those who dealt with him often said later, part of how he worked. He was not a cruel man in any ordinary sense. He did not raise his voice. He did not strike his servants. He gave generously to the church and paid for the annual orphans' Christmas dinner out of his own pocket. He was, in the phrase used by his pastor in the eulogy delivered 16 years later, a pillar. But pillars, as anyone who has stood beneath one in an old building knows, bear a great weight. And the weight presses downward, and what is beneath them is often the thing that is never questioned. His son, Ezra Bridgham, was 24, unmarried, home from 2 years at a business college in Boston, and widely expected to take over the mill within the decade. Ezra was taller than his father, better dressed than his father, and possessed of a laugh that people in Peton Falls heard, often in the saloons, along the canal, on weekend evenings. Although he was never drunk, or never quite drunk, because Ezra Bridgham knew precisely where the line was. He had a reputation among the girls in the weaving rooms, and that reputation was not a kind one. There were stories passed in whispers in the boarding houses and over kitchen tables, in French and Irish and Yankee English, about girls who had been cornered in stairwells, about girls who had been offered rides home in the Bridgham carriage and had accepted, and had not spoken of the ride afterward, about a girl 2 years before who had left town abruptly to live with an aunt in Rutland, Vermont, and had returned 10 months later, thinner and quieter, and with a look in her eyes that the women in the weaving rooms recognized without needing to name. But the reputation stayed inside the weaving rooms. It did not climb the hill to the White House. It did not, before that October morning, find its way into print anywhere in the state of Maine. Abigail Morse worked in the No. 2 weaving room on the 2nd floor of the South Mill. She had been there since she was 13, as her mother had been before her, and her older sister Mercy still was. The Morse family were Yankees, not Irish and not French, which in Peton Falls mattered in ways that were never spoken of directly, but organized every aspect of daily life. It meant they had a small clapboard house of their own on the edge of town, rather than a room in a boarding house on the canal. It meant Abigail had gone to the district school through the 6th grade and could read the Bible and write a clean hand, which she did in 3 surviving letters to a cousin in Lewiston. It meant when she was killed, there were people willing to ask questions, at least at first. Abigail's father had died in a logging accident when she was 11, crushed beneath a log that had rolled off a sled on a steep hillside above the river. Her mother, a quiet woman named Hannah, kept the family alive on the wages of her 2 daughters and a little piecework sewing she took in at night. There was no money for doctors, no money for a lawyer, no money for the kind of pressure that could hold a rich man's feet to a fire. There was only, as Hannah Morse would write later in a letter that never reached its address, a mother's memory of a daughter who had been, in her mother's words, bright and watchful and too pretty for her own safety in that town. Abigail was, by the accounts of the 3 women who worked the looms beside her, a serious girl. She was not flirtatious. She did not go to the dance halls on the canal. She saved her wages in a tin box under her bed, a box her mother would open 3 days after her funeral and find to contain 43.11, a sum that had been nearly 2 years in the accumulation, and that had been meant, though Hannah Morse did not know it yet, for a specific purpose. Abigail was in the autumn of 1887 engaged to be married, quietly, to a young man named Michael Thibodeau, a French-Canadian machinist 2 years older than her, who had saved enough to rent 2 rooms above a cooper's shop, and who was by every account steady and gentle and devoted to her. The engagement was not announced. Her mother approved of Michael Thibodeau, but the wider Morse family did not, because he was a Catholic and French and not their kind. And Abigail had learned at 19 that some things were easier to do than to explain. They were going to marry in the spring after the roads dried, and they were going to move to Lewiston, where Michael had been offered a position at a larger mill, and where no one would look sideways at a Yankee girl on the arm of a French boy. They had a plan. They had a future. The 43 in the tin box was the down payment on a small house on the outskirts of Lewiston, a house Michael had already walked past 4 times and described to her in letters that Abigail had read by candlelight in the small room she shared with her sister. On the afternoon of October 13, 1887, Abigail finished her shift at the number 2 weaving room at 7 minutes past 6, punched her card, said good night to her sister Mercy, and walked out into the dusk with a shawl over her hair and a tin lunch pail in her hand. Mercy Morse, who would survive her sister by 44 years, and would speak of that evening only twice in all the years that followed, once to a neighbor in 1900 and once to a priest in 1930, remembered that Abigail had seemed tired, but not unusually so. She had asked her to tell their mother that she would be home by 8, and had walked out by the canal gate rather than the main gate, which was slightly unusual, though Abigail sometimes did this when she wanted to stop at the small dry goods store on Water Street to buy thread or ribbon. It was the last time Mercy saw her sister standing. She was never seen alive again by anyone who would later admit to seeing her. The Androskagan River in October is cold. The water comes down from the lakes already dark, and by mid-month the nights drop below freezing and a skim of ice forms along the quiet shallows by morning. On the 14th of October, the sun rose at 62.6. At 6:30, a boy named Cyrus Fournier, 12 years old, walking his father's 2 milk cows down to the river to drink before the first bell, saw a shape at the edge of the water, just below the dam, where the current curled back on itself and made a slow pool behind the old grinding stones. The shape was long and pale and did not move. The boy would remember for the rest of his life the particular way the morning light had looked on the water. A flat gray light with a little pink in it, where the sun was coming up over the pines on the east bank, and the way his breath had come out in a cloud that hung for a second before drifting sideways, and the way the cows had stopped a few yards short of the shape and had lowed, not loudly, but in a sound he had never heard a cow make before, a sound that made the hair stand up on his arms before he understood what he was looking at. Cyrus Fournier dropped his switch and ran. He ran past the cows, past his own house, past the cooper's shop where Michael Thibodeau had just lit the stove, and he did not stop running until he reached the constable's house on Elm Street, where he pounded on the door with both fists and told the constable's wife, in a mixture of English and French, that there was a dead girl in the river. The constable was a man named Horace Pelletier, a French-Canadian who had been on the town payroll for 9 years, and who was by the common judgment of Peton Falls a decent and not especially clever man. He had a slow way of speaking and a slower way of thinking. Both had, in 9 years of minor peacekeeping in a company town, served him perfectly well, because the problems he was ever called on to solve were problems that had already been settled by someone else before he arrived. He arrived at the river at 6:45 with 2 deputies and a doctor named Ephraim Haw. Dr. Haw was also the town coroner, a position he held by vote of the selectmen and for which he was paid 12 a year ardu, he Swiss fee 7 y year r sol d, a wu I do a waterafo or a seixi ars, y teon idruon and sono and aduthon and etio divini twice a co liimb and ngor. Hiesha dia semema lula pura at cticsup pilal in tishid co ron and irsfee. A nadioed, a sofo cito br 14, 1887. A d betof 12 I year. He was 57 years old, alwid over 46 years, with Onigronsono had gone to divinity school in Bangor. He does malpractice of Fatsapalungtakaroner years fee and diode, as of October 14, 1887. Added 420 to the Bridge and Mill Company. A debt incurred by his late brother 3 years before, and for which Dr. Haw, as the only surviving family member of means, was legally responsible. The debt was not yet overdue. It would not come due for another 11 months. This fact is important, and we will return to it. What the 4 men saw when they pulled Abigail Morse from the shallows was recorded in different forms in 3 separate documents. And the 3 documents would not agree. The constable's log said simply that the deceased had been found face down in 2 feet of water, fully clothed except for her left shoe, with no visible injuries other than a bruise on the left temple consistent with a fall against rocks. Dr. Haw's initial notes, written in pencil on the back of a pharmacy receipt and later copied into his private diary, said something different. They said the bruise on the temple was too clean, too localized, to have come from tumbling among river stones. They said the fingernails of the right hand were broken and packed with fibers that looked like wool. Dark wool, the color of a man's coat. They said the clothing, when removed at the undertaker's shed, showed tearing at the collar and waist that had not come from water. They said there were marks on the inner wrists that could have been made by the pressure of a strong hand, and a line across the throat, faint but present, that could have been made by the edge of a forearm held there too long. And they said something else, in a line Dr. Hall later underlined 3 times. They said the body had been in the water for no more than 6 hours, which meant Abigail Morse had not gone into the river on the night of the 13th, when she had finished her shift, but sometime after midnight. After 5 hours, she could not be accounted for. 5 hours when she was somewhere in that town with someone alive. Word of a drowned mill girl moves through a mill town the way smoke moves through dry pine. By 9:00 in the morning, the looms in the number 2 weaving room had gone silent because Mercy Morse had been sent home, and the girls who worked beside her had followed. By 10, the news had reached the machinist's shop, and Michael Thibodeau had fallen to his knees on the floor, and had to be carried out by 2 of his countrymen, who laid him on a workbench in the back of the shop and spoke to him in French, in low voices for nearly an hour, while he did not answer, and did not weep, and only stared at the ceiling, as if he were reading something written there that no one else could see. By noon, a crowd of perhaps 200 people, mostly women, mostly French and Irish, had gathered outside the undertaker's shed on Bridge Street, and the constable had posted a deputy at the door. By 1:00 in the afternoon, Silas Bridgham had arrived at the shed in his carriage, had spoken privately with Dr. Haw for 7 minutes, and had left. What was said between them was never recorded. Dr. Haw's diary for that afternoon contains only 3 words, written in a hand that the man's own son later said was not his father's ordinary writing. Those 3 words were, "He knows already." At this point, if you are finding this story as unsettling as we are, do us a small favor. Hit the like button. Leave a comment telling us what you think happened to Abigail Morse, and share this video with someone who loves a mystery that refuses to rest. Your engagement is what keeps these forgotten cases from disappearing a second time. And now we continue. The first arrest came 6 days later. His name was Patrick Gallagher. He was 28 years old, an Irish loom fixer who had worked in the South Mill for 11 years. And he had, 3 weeks before Abigail Morse's death, been involved in a public argument with her outside the company store. The argument had been witnessed by at least 6 people, and its subject had been, according to every witness, Michael Thibodeau. Patrick Gallagher had, in the blunt language of the weaving rooms, been sweet on Abigail Morse for more than a year, and had been displeased to learn from a cousin of hers that she was engaged to a French boy. 3 weeks before her death, he had approached her outside the store on a Saturday afternoon, when the street was full of people, and had said something the witnesses remembered with varying clarity, but all agreed had been angry. Something about her being too good for a papist. Something about her throwing herself away. Something about her regretting it. And she had slapped him in the face in front of everyone. And he had walked away with his cheek red and his mouth working. 2 of the witnesses said he had turned back before he was out of earshot and called her a word they would not repeat under oath. One of them said he had simply stood for a long moment with his fists clenched and then had walked off without a word. No one had followed him. No one had reported the incident at the time. It had been, in the life of a mill town in 1887, an ordinary thing. On the afternoon of October 19th, Constable Pelletier arrested Patrick Gallagher at his boarding house on the canal and took him to the town jail. The charge was murder in the 1st degree. Patrick Gallagher, according to the constable's own account, was drunk when he was arrested, though not violent, and he did not resist. He said only, over and over as the constable led him down the stairs of the boarding house, that he had not done it, that he had been with friends on the night in question, that they would swear to it, and that he wanted a priest. A priest was sent for. The priest, Father O'Brien, who had served the Irish parish for 6 years, spent an hour with Patrick Gallagher in the jail that evening and emerged, according to the deputy who was on duty, looking shaken but saying nothing. The trial, such as it was, began 4 weeks later in the 2nd-floor courtroom of the Oxford County Courthouse, 12 miles away in the county seat of Paris, Maine. It lasted 3 days. The prosecution called 8 witnesses, 4 of whom testified to the argument outside the store. Dr. Hall was not called. His written report entered into evidence, said only what his official log had said, that the deceased had been found face down in 2 feet of water, fully clothed except for her left shoe, with a bruise on the left temple consistent with a fall. The notes about the clean bruise, the torn clothing, the wool fibers under the fingernails, the marks on the wrists, the line on the throat, the 6 hours in the water, were not in that report. Dr. Hall had written a second report, a clean one, sometime between October 15th and October 20th. And the second report was the one the court saw. The defense, paid for by a collection taken up among the Irish workers of the South Mill, called a single witness, a woman named Bridget Lassard, who ran a boarding house on the canal, and who swore under oath that Patrick Gallagher had been in her common room playing cards with 4 other men from 7:00 in the evening of October 13th until past 2:00 in the morning of the 14th. The 4 other men were called. The 4 other men confirmed. They named the game they had played, which was Utrecht, the stakes, which were pennies, and the brand of whiskey they had been drinking, local corn whiskey distilled by a Scotsman named Mallister in the next town over. The details were consistent. The witnesses did not contradict each other. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. Patrick Gallagher was acquitted on all counts and walked out of the courthouse into a cold November rain. And the Irish of Peton Falls did not celebrate, because they understood, without needing to speak it, that the question of who had actually killed Abigail Morse had not been asked and would not be asked, and that their man had been the easiest man to accuse, and that the ease of it was itself a warning. What Dr. Ephraim Haw did in the days between October 15th and October 20th, when he rewrote the coroner's report, is the first of the 3 silences at the heart of this story. The original pencil notes survived folded into his diary, which was preserved by his granddaughter and donated to the Maine Historical Society in 1947, where they sat uncatalogued until a graduate student found them in 1981. The notes do not say why he rewrote the report. They say only, in an entry dated October 17th, that he had received a visit at his house from a man he called only S.B., who had stayed for 1 hour, and that after the visit he had walked down to the river alone and stood on the bridge for a long time, and that when he came home he had not eaten his supper. There is no entry for October 18th. The entry for October 19th, the day of Patrick Gallagher's arrest, says in full, "I am not the man I was a week ago. God forgive me." The handwriting in that entry is the tight, cramped handwriting of a man writing with a shaking hand. The winter of 1887 into 1888 was hard in Peton Falls, as winters in western Maine are hard. The river froze in the shallows. Snow drifted up against the north walls of the mills and had to be shoveled by boys with scoops every morning before the shift. The price of coal rose. A diphtheria outbreak in the French part of town killed 14 children between Christmas and February. In the weaving rooms, the women worked in layers of clothing and wet their lips against chapping, and did not speak of Abigail Morse, because the overseers had made it clear that speaking of Abigail Morse was a thing that could get a woman's hours cut. Mercy Morse kept her position. She did not miss a day. She came home each evening and sat with her mother at the small table in their kitchen, and they ate their supper in silence, and neither of them asked the question that was sitting at the table with them, because neither of them had the answer, and because asking would have made not having the answer harder to bear. The second arrest came in February of 1888. His name was Jonas Chadwick. He was 42 years old. The overseer of the number 2 weaving room, which meant he had been Abigail Morse's direct supervisor for the last 6 years of her life. He was a Cornish immigrant, unmarried, and lived alone in a cottage on the mill's property. He was known among the women in the weaving room as a strict, but not cruel overseer. A man who kept his distance, who did not joke, who did not drink, who attended the Methodist chapel on Sunday mornings, and was not otherwise seen socially by anyone. He had been, the new evidence claimed, seen walking with Abigail Morse along the canal path on 3 separate evenings. In the 2 months before her death, at hours when the weaving rooms had long since closed. The evidence was presented by a 14-year-old Doffer boy named Samuel Hodkins, who came forward in late January and swore to the constable that he had seen what he had seen. The boy was specific. He named the dates. He described the clothing. He said Abigail Morse had been crying on the second of the 3 occasions, and that Jonas Chadwick had been walking close beside her, speaking to her in a low voice, and that, when they had passed the boy, who was standing in the shadow of a warehouse on an errand for his father. Abigail had wiped her face with the back of her hand, and had not seen him. The constable took the statement. A warrant was issued. Jonas Chadwick was arrested at his cottage at dawn on the morning of February 9th. The trial began 3 weeks later. On the second day of the trial, Samuel Hodkins did not appear. A deputy sent to his parents' boarding house returned with the news that the boy was gone, that his family said he had left for an uncle's farm in New Hampshire, and that they did not know when he would return and would not be able to produce him. The prosecution asked for a delay. The judge, a man named Willoughby Payne, who had been on the bench for 19 years and was known to keep a very tight docket, denied it. The prosecution called its other witnesses, 2 women from the weaving room, who had heard Samuel Hodkins say what he had seen, but who could not themselves testify to seeing it. Hearsay, the defense objected. Sustained, the judge ruled. The prosecution had nothing else. The defense, paid for by no collection but by a retainer that the court records did not trace, called Jonas Chadwick to the stand. He denied every accusation in a flat, exhausted voice. The jury deliberated for less than an hour and returned a verdict of not guilty. Jonas Chadwick walked out of the courthouse, returned to Peton Falls, packed his belongings into a single trunk, and left on the evening train to Portland. He did not resign his position at the mill. His position was quietly filled the following week, and his name was not mentioned in the company records again, except in a single line in the payroll book that read, "Settlement paid 60 point. Samuel Hodkins, the Doffer boy, was never seen in Peton Falls again." His parents stayed. His mother continued to work in the weaving rooms. The uncle in New Hampshire was never named, and no such uncle appears in any genealogical record that has since been searched. The parents, questioned years later by a reporter from the Lewiston Evening Journal, refused to speak of their son. The mother is said to have wept. The father is said to have stood up, walked to the door of his parlor, opened it, and waited in silence until the reporter left. What happened to Samuel Hodkins is among the many questions this case leaves us with. Perhaps the one that has most troubled the small number of historians who have looked at it. The uncle does not exist. The farm does not exist. The boy is not buried in any cemetery in Oxford County, nor in any cemetery in Coos County, New Hampshire. His name disappears from the federal census after 1880. He is, as far as the written record is concerned, a boy who said a thing and then ceased to be. Just when we thought we had seen the worst of this town's silences, the story turns again, and it turns in a direction that will force us to ask whether anyone in Peton Falls, in that cold spring of 1888, was still telling the truth about anything. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and subscribe if you have not yet, because what comes next is what broke the town apart. Let us discover together what happened in the third trial. The third arrest came in August of 1888. Its announcement was met in Peton Falls with something that was not quite surprise and not quite relief, but resembled, in the accounts of the few who wrote about it, a long exhalation of held breath. The accused was Ezra Bridgham, the son of the mill owner, 24 years old, heir to the White House on the Hill. The evidence against him had come finally from Dr. Ephraim Hall in the last week of July. Hall, now 58 years old and visibly ill, with what his son would later identify as the beginning of the stomach cancer that would kill him the following spring. had walked into the office of the county district attorney in Paris, Maine, carrying a leather satchel, and had placed on the district attorney's desk his original pencil notes from October 14th, a copy of his diary, and a signed affidavit. The affidavit ran to 4 pages in his own cramped hand, and it laid out, with the methodical precision of a man who had been rehearsing the words for a long time, exactly what he said had happened. It said that he had falsified the coroner's report in October under pressure from Silas Brigham, that the pressure had taken the form of a conversation in his parlor on the afternoon of October 17th, during which Silas Brigham had reminded him, without ever raising his voice, of the $420 debt owed by his late brother to the Brigham Mill Company, and had mentioned, now without ever explicitly threatening, that the debt could be either forgiven in full or called in full, and that it had occurred to him that the doctor might find it easier to write a simpler report than the one he had originally drafted. A report more in keeping with what the community would find comforting in a tragic accident. The affidavit said that the debt had been forgiven on November 1st, 1887, in writing by Silas Brigham's own hand. The affidavit said that the bruise on Abigail Morse's temple had been inflicted before her immersion in the river, and was consistent with a blow from a man's fist. That the torn clothing and the wool fibers under her fingernails indicated she had fought her attacker. That the marks on the wrists and the throat indicated restraint and suffocation. And that she had, in the doctor's medical judgment, been strangled to unconsciousness before being placed in the water, where she had drowned while still breathing but unable to resist. And it said finally that he had reason to believe, from what he had heard in the undertaker's shed on the afternoon of October 14th, that the attacker had been Ezra Brigham, because Silas Brigham, when he had arrived at the shed that afternoon and had been shown the body, had not asked any of the questions a man who did not already know the answers would have asked. The district attorney was a man named Hiram Crocker, a Republican from the southern part of the county, who owed nothing to the Brigham family, and who, according to his own later memoir, read the affidavit twice and then sat at his desk for a long time with his eyes closed. And then he issued the warrant. Ezra Brigham was arrested at his father's house on the evening of August 3rd, taken to the county jail in Paris, and held without bail. The news, when it reached Peton Falls on the morning of August 4th, traveled through the mill in less than 20 minutes. The loom stopped. The women did not cheer. They did not weep. They stood at their machines, according to one of the 3 surviving letters Mercy Morse wrote to her cousin in Lewiston. And they looked at each other, and they said nothing at all. And after a long moment, they started the looms again, because the overseers were shouting, and the mill did not stop for the dead. The trial of Ezra Brigham began on September 11, 1888. It was by every measure the most closely watched criminal proceeding in the history of Oxford County to that date. Reporters came from Portland, from Lewiston, from Augusta, and from as far as Boston. The courtroom seated 112 people and held on the first day closer to 200, with the overflow standing against the back wall and filling the stairwell. The air in the room by mid-morning was thick enough that one reporter wrote of having to loosen his collar to breathe, and the windows were kept open even as the September air outside grew cold, so that the voices of the lawyers and witnesses had to carry over the rustle of papers, the scrape of chairs, and the occasional shout of a newsboy on the street below. The prosecution was conducted personally by Hiram Crocker. The defense was conducted by a 3-man team from Boston, led by a criminal lawyer named Everett Pike, who had defended railroad companies, bank officers, and 2 congressmen, and who had never in a career of 26 years lost a murder trial. Silas Bridgham had spared no expense. The cost of the defense, according to a letter Silas Brigham's accountant wrote to an insurance underwriter the following year, was $7,200, which was more than Dr. Hall had earned as coroner in his entire career. The prosecution's case rested on 4 pillars. First, the revised coroner's testimony, now given under oath by Dr. Hall from the witness stand, with the original pencil notes entered into evidence. Second, the testimony of a housemaid at the Bridgham residence, a 19-year-old girl named Sarah Daring, who swore that on the night of October 13th, Ezra Bridgham had returned home at some hour past 2:00 in the morning with mud on his boots and a scratch on his right cheek, and that she had heard him from her small room off the kitchen, washing his hands in the scullery for what she estimated to be nearly half an hour, and that the next morning she had been asked to take a certain coat to the town's dressmaker with instructions to clean it with particular care, and that the coat had been damp and had smelled faintly but unmistakably of river. Third, the testimony of a night watchman at the South Mill, a man named Owen Mackey, who swore that at approximately 8:30 on the evening of October 13th, he had seen Ezra Bridgham walking along the canal path in the direction of the Morse house with his coat collar turned up against the cold, and that at approximately 1:00 in the morning, he had seen the same man walking back in the opposite direction, alone, moving quickly, no longer wearing the coat. Fourth, the testimony of Michael Thibodeau, Abigail's fiancé, who swore that Abigail had told him 2 weeks before her death that Ezra Bridgham had approached her in the weaving room corridor and had made, in her words, an offer she had refused, and had then said to her, in a voice she remembered as quiet and unbothered, that she would regret the refusal. Michael Thibodeau further testified that Abigail had told him she intended to leave the mill before the wedding, even though it would cost them the money they were saving, because she did not feel safe in that corridor anymore, and that he had asked her why she had not told her mother or her sister, and that she had said, with a small sad smile he remembered vividly, that some things a girl kept to herself in that town if she wanted to keep her job. Every one of the 4 pillars, over the 3 weeks of the trial, was pulled down. Dr. Haw, under cross-examination by Everett Pike, was questioned for 11 hours across 2 days. Pike did not attempt to dispute the pencil notes. That was not his strategy. He attempted, and succeeded, in establishing that Dr. Hall had for 11 months lied under oath and in writing, had accepted what amounted to a bribe from Silas Bridgham, had falsified a public document, and was now dying of cancer and afraid for his soul, offering testimony that could not be verified by any other living person, and that was, by Pike's careful construction of the record, equally consistent with a desire to injure the Bridgham family for reasons the doctor himself could not quite name. Pike was polite throughout. He did not raise his voice. He referred to the doctor as Sir. He asked at one point, with a tone of almost gentle concern, whether it was not possible that a man in Dr. Haw's condition, near the end of his life and carrying a weight of guilt that no man should have to carry alone, might not be shaping his memories to fit the shape of the confession he felt he needed to make. Dr. Haw, who had been on the stand for 6 hours at that point, did not answer for a long time. When he answered, he said only, "I am telling the truth." Pike nodded and said, "I am sure you believe you are." The jury, Pike suggested with great politeness across the remainder of the cross-examination, was being asked to convict a young man of murder on the sworn word of a self-confessed perjurer. Dr. Haw, by the end of his testimony, was gray-faced and trembling. He left the stand and did not return to the courtroom. He returned to Peton Falls on the evening train, went home to his empty house, and began that night to write his will. Sarah Daring, the housemaid, was questioned for 2 hours on the morning of September 20th. She confirmed her prior statement. She described the mud, the scratch, the washing of the hands, the coat. She was then asked by Everett Pike whether it was not true that she had been dismissed from the Bridgham household in July of 1888, 3 weeks before coming forward with her testimony for the theft of a silver spoon. She admitted that it was true. She was asked whether she had not been overheard in the company's store on the day of her dismissal to swear that she would, in her words, see the son of a bitch hang if it took her the rest of her life. She denied it. 3 witnesses were produced who swore they had heard her say it. The jury watched her face redden and her hands shake. And when Pike released her from the stand, she left the courtroom weeping and was not called again. Owen Mackey, the night watchman, did not appear on the day he was scheduled to testify. A deputy sent to his tenement found the door locked and the rooms empty. His wife, questioned the following morning, said only that her husband had left on the night train to Boston and that he had not told her why, that he had left her with a 30 AINC, ASH, an NDTH T-Sech de Duno TEXP and CTAR IMTORE to Uronium Leviarja Snor VFOU and D. HIS dias a PPOR and CMUS rari pure TADTOT, imbios tonen piolio IC no buduro asarari COV rari D. Enosagatai nevidu associon FIRMED, TA 38 in cash, and Thatcher did not expect them to return. Owen Mackey was never found. His disappearance was reported to the Boston police. No body was confirmed. No sighting was confirmed. The 38. His wife later acknowledged under further questioning by the reporter from the Threatland Daily Press was more than 3 months of his wages. Where it had come from, she could not say. She would say, some years later, that a man in a dark coat had come to her door 2 days before her husband's departure and had spoken with him on the porch for about 10 minutes, and that she had not recognized the man, and that after the man had gone, her husband had come inside and had sat at the kitchen table and had not spoken for the rest of the evening, and that in the morning she had found on the dresser beside their bed the 38, and her husband had not been in the house. Michael Thibodeau, the fiancé, took the stand on September 24th. He was 21 years old. He had not slept properly in 11 months. He spoke in English that was clear but slow, and he answered every question in a voice that the Portland reporter described as the voice of a man speaking across a great distance. He repeated what Abigail had told him. He described the conversation. He named Ezra Brigham. He was asked by Hiram Crocker whether he had any doubt that Abigail had told him the truth. He said he had none. And then, on cross-examination, Everett Pike asked him a single question. Pike asked him whether he had, in the week following Abigail Morse's death, been overheard in a saloon on the canal to swear in the hearing of at least 4 men that he would kill Ezra Brigham with his own hands. Michael Thibodeau said nothing for a long moment. Then he said yes. Pike asked him whether a man who had publicly sworn to murder the defendant could be trusted to tell the truth about words the defendant had allegedly spoken to a dead girl 11 months before. Michael Thibodeau did not answer. Pike thanked him and sat down. The prosecution attempted a redirect. Hiram Crocker asked whether the grief of a man whose fiancée had been murdered might not reasonably produce a moment of drunken anger that did not reflect his ordinary character. Michael Thibodeau said yes. But the damage was done, and the jury had seen what Pike had wanted them to see, a man who wanted Ezra Brigham dead badly enough to have said so in public. The defense, after all this, called only 3 witnesses. a Boston physician who testified that the injuries Dr. Haw had described could, in his professional opinion, have been caused by the mechanical action of a body in a river over a period of hours. A Peton Falls minister who testified to Ezra Brigham's excellent character, and Silas Brigham himself, who took the stand on the morning of September 30th and spoke for 45 minutes without ever raising his voice. About his son, about his mill, about his town, about the tragic death of a young woman whom he had known by sight and for whose family he had the deepest sympathy. He wept once, briefly, near the end of his testimony, on speaking of his own late wife and of the children they had raised together. The Boston reporter observed that he had, in his entire time covering the courts, rarely seen a more effective witness. The jury deliberated for 6 hours on the evening of October 2, 1888. They returned at 9:45 that night, with a verdict of not guilty on all counts. Ezra Brigham embraced his father in the front row of the courtroom. Silas Brigham was seen to weep openly, which was, according to 3 separate correspondents, the first public display of emotion anyone present had ever seen from him. The Brigham family left Paris, Maine by private carriage that same night. They returned to Peton Falls. The mill reopened the following Monday. Ezra Brigham was promoted to assistant superintendent in January of 1889. He married in 1891 the daughter of a Portland shipping family. He had 4 children. He lived until 1946 and was in his later years a trustee of the Maine Historical Society and a donor to several worthy causes, including the restoration of a small congregational chapel in his hometown, which by the time of his death had been closed for 2 decades and stood empty on a hillside above the silted-in canal. Dr. Ephraim Haw died of stomach cancer on March 17, 1889, 5 months after the verdict. On his deathbed, according to the son who was with him at the end, he said only over and over the same phrase in a voice that was barely a whisper. The phrase was, "They are all paid." What Dr. Haw meant by that phrase is the final question this story leaves us with. And it is the question that cannot be answered by any document, any testimony, or any honest reading of the evidence, because the answer requires us to believe a thing that no court in 1888 could have found and no court since has been willing to find. The pattern, when you lay the 3 trials side by side, does not look like justice failing. It looks like a machine working exactly as it was designed to work. In the first trial, the witnesses who alibied Patrick Gallagher were all residents of a boarding house owned by a man who held a mortgage from the Brigham Mill Company. And the mortgage, according to the county recorder's office, was forgiven in full in the spring of 1888, 6 months after the trial. In the second trial, the boy Samuel Hodkins, whose testimony would have convicted Jonas Chadwick, disappeared to an uncle who does not exist in any census, and his parents, who did not leave Peton Falls, were moved within 6 months of the trial from a double room on the canal into a small, but clean rented house on Maple Street. The rent on which, according to the landlord's surviving ledger, was paid in cash each month by a party the ledger identified only as PEF, Mill Company. In the third trial, the night watchman Owen Mackey vanished with 38 he could not have saved, and the housemaid Sarah Daring, after her humiliation on the witness stand, was found 2 weeks later hanged in a rented room in Portland, and the inquest conducted by a coroner who was not Dr. Hall ruled her death a suicide without examining the rope. The rope, according to the single surviving item in the Portland coroner's records, was a length of new hemp of a type commonly used in mill machinery, and it had been cut from a longer piece by a clean, fresh saw mark. None of these facts, taken singly, proves anything. The boarding house mortgage was common. The rented house on Maple Street could have been paid for by a kindly aunt. The 38 could have been savings. The hanging could have been a suicide. And this is the precise point at which the pattern hides itself. Because each separate suspicious fact dissolves under close examination into the ordinary texture of life in a mill town in 1888, where the mill owned the mortgages, the houses, the jobs, the newspapers, the selectmen who appointed the coroner, the sheriff who chose which warrants to serve, and, in ways that were never quite written down, the consciences of the men who held all those offices. The pattern is only visible when you step back from the separate facts and look at them together. And even then, what you see is not a conspiracy in the modern sense, not a meeting of men in a locked room, but something older and quieter, and in its way more terrible. You see a town, an entire town, tacitly agreeing that a certain answer could not be arrived at because the answer would require the town to dismantle itself. And so instead, 3 different men were tried and 3 different acquittals were obtained. And each acquittal, because it was honestly won in a court of law by a jury that had reasonable doubt, closed a door that could not afterward be reopened. By the time the 3rd door closed, it was no longer possible under any remaining legal theory to accuse anyone else. Double jeopardy had attached. The principle of finality, which the law holds sacred, had sealed each verdict shut. The case was not solved. It was completed. There is a difference between the 2 words, and the difference is the distance between a confession and a burial. And that, perhaps, is what Dr. Hall meant when he said with his last breath that they were all paid. He did not mean only the jurors, although the jurors may have been. He did not mean only the witnesses who disappeared or died, although those payments are the most traceable. He meant, I think, something larger. He meant the entire machinery of a town that had for a generation accepted the bargain of the mill. The bargain that said, you may have wages and houses and schools and a church and a certain kind of decent life. And in exchange, you will not ask, when a mill girl is pulled from the river with wool fibers under her fingernails, who it was she fought before she died. He meant that the payment was not only in money. The payment was in silence, and the silence had been accepted, and the acceptance had become by the autumn of 1888 indistinguishable from the town itself. A town is a thing that agrees over time on what it will not see. Peton Falls had made that agreement, and the agreement had held, and a girl was in the ground, and the wheels of the looms kept turning. And the water kept falling over the dam, and the great pale hands of Silas Bridgham had folded themselves at last over a job well done. Abigail Morse was buried on October 16, 1887, in the Yankee Cemetery at the north edge of Peton Falls. Her stone is small white marble and reads only her name, her dates, and the words taken early. Her mother Hannah lived another 19 years and never remarried and never spoke of the case in her remaining letters, of which 7 survive. In one of those letters, written in 1893 to her sister in Lewiston, she mentions her younger daughter only once, in passing, referring to her as, "my Abigail who is not here." And the phrase has the quality, to anyone who reads it now, of a door that has been closed so gently and for so long that it has fused with a wall. Her sister Mercy worked in the mill for the rest of her life. She married a grocer's assistant in 1894, had 3 children, and died in 1931. Her children, interviewed in the 1970s, said their mother had spoken of her sister, perhaps 4 times in all the years they had known her, and always in the same phrase, that Abigail had been the prettier one, and that she had deserved better, and that there were people in that town who knew what had happened and had chosen not to say. The children had not asked her what she meant. They had been afraid to. One of them, the eldest, said in the interview that she regretted that now, but that at the time it had seemed cruel to ask, and that her mother had worn her silence the way some women wore widow's weeds, and that you did not pull at such a garment. Michael Thibodeau did not kill Ezra Brigham. He left Peton Falls 1 week after the verdict, moved to Woonsocket, Rhode Island, took a job in a cotton mill there, and, according to a great-nephew who was traced in the 1970s, never again spoke the name Abigail aloud, though he kept in a small wooden box on his dresser until the day he died in 1938, a tintype photograph of a young woman with dark hair and a direct, unsmiling gaze. He never married. The photograph was buried with him at his written request, in the left breast pocket of his burial suit. The great-nephew, who was a boy of 11 when Michael Thibodeau died, remembered only that his great-uncle had been a quiet man who made him wooden toys in a small workshop behind the boarding house where he lived, and that once, the boy having asked why the old man lived alone, Michael Thibodeau had stopped his planing and had looked at him for a long moment and had said only, in a voice the boy never forgot, "Because I was not there," and he had gone back to his work. Peton Falls itself did not survive the century. The mills began to close in the 1890s as the cotton industry moved south, chasing lower wages and longer hours and workers who did not yet know how to organize. The last mill closed in 1921. The population fell. The White House on the hill was sold, subdivided, and eventually torn down in 1954 to make way for a highway interchange that was never built. The company store became a hardware store, then a pharmacy, then a vacancy. The canal silted in. The town by the 1970s had fewer than 800 residents and was unincorporated. It is today not on most maps. Drivers who pass through on the county road see a few empty brick shells along the river, a boarded-up church, a small cemetery with Yankee names, and move on without knowing that they have crossed the ground where a girl was killed in the autumn of 1887, and where for 11 months a town performed upon itself the elaborate ritual of proving that no one at all was responsible. The Morse file, the full file with the 3 trial transcripts, the diaries, the letters, the payroll ledgers, the Portland inquest, the Brigham accountant's correspondence, Hannah Morse's 7 letters, Dr. Hawes' pencil notes, and the small surviving fragments of the boarding house mortgage, was assembled for the first time in 2003 by a local historian named Margaret Esther Fallon, who published her findings in a small academic journal called the New England Review of Labor History, and who died in a car accident on a dry road on a clear afternoon, 3 weeks after the article appeared. The driver of the other car was not identified. The journal remains available. The file remains available. The answer it points to is not strictly speaking an answer. It is a shape. It is the shape of a town closing around a killing, the way a fist closes around a coin, and keeping the coin, and passing eventually out of history with the coin still inside. This mystery shows us that sometimes the most terrifying thing in a story is not a single monster, but an entire community that has decided, without ever holding a vote, that some truths will cost too much to speak. Abigail Morse did not drown. 3 men were accused and 3 men went free, not because the law failed, but because the law worked precisely as powerful men had arranged for it to work. What do you think of this story? Do you believe the 3rd man was the killer? Or is there a 4th possibility we have not yet considered? Do you think Dr. Haw told the whole truth at the end, or only as much of it as he could bear to say? Was Margaret Esther Fallon's accident truly an accident? Or did the long arm of a dead mill town reach out one last time to close a hand it had been holding shut for more than a century? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forgotten crimes pulled from the archives of American history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that refuse to stay buried. The dead do not rest when the living refuse to remember them.